The first thing I remember is the smell: iodine, smoke, and winter. We had turned a schoolhouse into a field hospital. Its walls still carried children's drawings beneath the bullet holes. Outside, artillery echoed like a heartbeat. The front was close, too close, but the wounded never stopped coming. They arrived on sleds, on trucks, sometimes carried by other soldiers whose faces were as pale as the snow. My name is Anya Morozova, Medical Corps, Red Army. I was 21, and I had already seen more blood than I thought existed in the world. We worked in shifts that blurred together: stitching, boiling water, scraping frost off the inside of windows. There was never enough morphine, never enough light. The lamps burned with kerosene fumes that made our eyes sting. One night, as the shells landed closer, a sergeant staggered through the door carrying a young man with half his coat burned away. His pulse fluttered weakly under my fingers. I pressed gauze against the wound, whispering his name again and again until he opened his eyes. He was barely older than me. "Am I dying?" he asked in a voice rough with smoke. "Not tonight," I lied. We lost power soon after. The building shook with each explosion, dust raining from the ceiling. I worked by candlelight, hands numb, blood stiffening my sleeves. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was singing softly, one of the nurses trying to keep the men calm. When dawn came, the bombardment had stopped, but so had the sergeant's breathing. I sat on the floor beside him, exhausted, the candle burned down to nothing. I thought of home, of my mother's kitchen in Smolensk, of the apple trees that must now be blackened stumps. I hadn't received a letter in months. No one had. Later that morning, an officer came in and told us we were to evacuate. The Germans were advancing again. He said it calmly, as if he were reading the weather. "Take what you can," he said. "Leave the rest." We looked around the room, at the stretchers, the bandages, the men who couldn't walk. And then we knew what the rest meant. We whispered so the wounded wouldn't hear us choosing. "How many stretchers?" I asked. 8, said Vera, the head nurse. "And 20 who can't stand." Outside, trucks idled in the frost, smoke hanging low like fog. Inside, we moved through classrooms turned wards, deciding who could live through the road ahead. Some we lifted. Some we could only touch and say, "We'll be back." I found the boy from last night, Misha, the one who'd asked if he was dying. He gripped my sleeve. "You said not tonight." "Not tonight," I said, and signaled 2 orderlies. He smiled weakly before the cold took his breath again. Shells began falling closer. Windows rattled. The surgeon shouted, "Evacuate now," his voice cracked like ice. Then a soldier burst in, half carrying a man in a torn gray coat, an enemy uniform. "Found him outside," he said. "He'll bleed out." Vera froze. "Triage him outside." But the boy's face was just another face in pain. "Put him here," I said. "Anya, we don't choose who needs a bandage." My hands worked without thinking, pressing gauze, wrapping the wound. He whispered something I didn't understand. "Gratitude, maybe. Or just breathe." Another blast shook the floor. "Go," the surgeon yelled. "Now or never." We formed a line, nurses, soldiers, anyone with hands. The cold cut like knives as we carried the wounded to the trucks. I climbed into the last one with Misha, and 3 others barely holding on. The engine roared, gears grinding, snow whipping our faces. Through the cracked window, I saw Vera counting heads, lips moving around names we'd never finish saying. Behind her, the gray-coated boy lay breathing shallow on a cot. The road out was a wound through the forest. Snow erased our tracks almost instantly. I talked to Misha to keep him awake, told him about my mother's apple trees, about summers that felt endless. He smiled once, faintly, before drifting away. We reached the river at dusk. The bridge was damaged, boards laid over broken steel. The driver crossed himself twice, then drove slow as prayer. The water groaned beneath us. I held my breath, counted to 100 and again. On the far side, the first ambulance train waited, 3 cars and a weak fire that smelled of wet wood. We lifted the wounded aboard. The surgeon touched my shoulder. "You did well." Not enough, I said. He nodded. Never enough. As the train moved east, I watched the smoke of the village fade into the snow. Somewhere behind us, those we left whispered our names into the dark. The train rattled east through a land buried in white. Each jolt made the lamps sway, shadows crawling across the wounded. The air smelled of metal and boiled bandages. Every breath tasted like smoke. Vera and I worked in silence, changing dressings, checking pulses. There was no morphine left, only boiled water and cloth. Misha slept fitfully, whispering names I didn't know. When dawn came, the train stopped in the middle of nowhere. The engineer shouted that the track ahead was gone. A bridge bombed out again. We were ordered to unload until repairs could be made. Outside, wind scraped across the steppe. We built a makeshift station from snow and tarps. A supply convoy was expected by night, but until then we waited, doctors, nurses, and 30 wounded men surrounded by emptiness. At midday, I saw movement on the ridge, figures in gray coats. Through binoculars, the captain counted 6. Scouts may be more behind them. We armed ourselves with the few rifles left on the train. If they come close, Vera whispered, buy time for the wounded. But the figures turned away, disappearing into snow like ghosts. We stayed ready anyway. By evening, the temperature dropped so fast the air itself seemed to break. The engineer begged to move the train back a few kilometers to shelter, but the surgeon refused. We can't move them again, he said. I sat by the fire barrel with Misha. He was awake, his skin pale as paper. You should go, he murmured. I can't, I said. You'd freeze. He gave a weak laugh. Then we'll freeze together. The words stuck to the air like frost. Later, I went to fetch snow to melt for water. Near the embankment, I saw a thin column of smoke, too straight to be from us. Someone else had fire out there. I hesitated, then grabbed my rifle and followed it. Behind a fallen birch, I found a small dugout half buried in snow. Inside, a man sat wrapped in a torn blanket, his arm bound with one of our Red Cross bandages. The same boy in the gray coat. The one I had saved. He stared at me startled, then lowered his head. You followed? He asked in broken Russian. I saw the smoke, I said. You shouldn't be here. They'll shoot you. He smiled faintly. They already did. His wound was reopening. I replaced the bandage, hands steady despite the shaking. Stay until dawn, I said. Then go north. The front will pass you soon. He looked at me with those exhausted blue eyes. Why help me again? I answered honestly. Because someone should. When I returned, Vera met me at the train door, her expression sharp. You were gone too long. I was checking the perimeter, I said. She studied me for a long moment, then turned away. Try to sleep. Tomorrow we move. That night, the wind screamed through the broken wagons. I thought of the boy in the snow and hoped the cold was merciful. Morning came gray and soundless. The landscape was nothing but snow and smoke, as if the world had forgotten color. The engineer shouted the tracks were clear, repairs finished in the night. We began to reload the wounded, breath fogging in the brittle air. Misha was lighter than I remembered. I lifted him with another nurse, feeling every rib beneath the blanket. He smiled faintly. You're still here. Still, I said. You owe me a spring apple. He tried to laugh but only coughed. The whistle blew. Everyone hurried, fear making their steps quick. The front was moving again. We could hear the low, steady thunder of artillery behind the hills. As the last stretcher was loaded, I looked toward the tree line. Smoke no longer rose from where I had found the gray-coated boy. I told myself he was gone north like I'd said. But part of me knew better. Inside the train, Vera passed among the cots, counting. 32, she said. That's all that made it. How many started? I asked. She didn't answer. The train lurched forward. For a moment, it felt like escape. Then came the sound we all feared, aircraft. A whine building in the clouds above. Down, someone shouted. The lamps swung wildly as the first blast hit the tracks ahead. The train screamed to a stop. I threw myself over Misha as glass shattered and heat washed through the car. Silence. Then fire. I dragged Misha and 2 others toward the back. Smoke poured through the broken windows, thick and black. Outside, the forest burned in slow orange waves. The air reeked of oil and iron. We stumbled into the snow. Vera was already there, face streaked with soot, shouting orders through the chaos. Together, we pulled as many as we could away from the flames. The train was dying in pieces, cars collapsing into the frozen ditch. I knelt beside Misha. His chest barely moved. "Stay awake," I said. "We're almost safe." He looked past me, eyes glassy. "It's warm," he whispered. And then he was still. For a long time, I couldn't move. The fire cracked and roared, and somewhere behind me, Vera was crying out names that no one answered. When the bombing stopped, only 7 of us were left standing. We gathered what we could: blankets, canteens, a single crate of supplies. The snow fell harder, trying to cover what it could not forgive. Vera put a hand on my shoulder. "We keep moving east," she said softly. "If we stop, it ends here." I nodded, though my legs felt hollow. I took one last look at the wrecked train, the twisted metal glowing in the snow, and then turned toward the endless white ahead. We walked until night erased the horizon. The wind cut our faces raw, and the snow swallowed every sound. 7 of us, 2 nurses, 4 wounded men, and 1 soldier who could still fire a rifle. No one spoke. Words felt too heavy to carry. We found shelter in the ruins of a farmhouse, half buried in ice. Inside, a stove leaned against a wall like an exhausted animal. I coaxed a small fire from scraps of wood and torn bandages. The smoke rose slow, curling around our breath. Vera sat beside me, her hands trembling. "If the front keeps moving, they'll find us in a day or 2, she said. "And if not, then we make our own way." The soldier laughed quietly. "East is always farther than it looks." I said nothing. My eyes fixed on the snow outside, the shapes it made in the wind. Each drift could have been a body. Each sound could have been Misha breathing again. When dawn came, I stepped out alone. The forest glowed faint blue under the rising sun. Everything was still, too still. I saw something in the distance, half buried near a birch stump. I walked closer and found a scrap of cloth, gray and stiff with frost. A piece of a coat sleeve. The boy from the other side. The one I had saved twice. I knelt in the snow and brushed the fabric clean. Beneath it, the faint outline of a cross scratched into the wood of the tree. Not a grave. A memory. I stayed there a long time, the wind singing through the pines. I didn't cry. There was nothing left for tears to wash away. When I returned, Vera had the fire going stronger. "You all right?" she asked. "Yes," I lied. "He made it." She smiled faintly and handed me a tin of melted snow water. Then one of us did. The days blurred after that. We were rescued by a supply patrol 2 nights later. They called us heroes, but I never believed that word. Heroes save lives. We only borrowed time. Years later, long after the war ended, I planted an apple tree outside the new hospital in Smolensk. Every spring it bloomed white as snow, and I told my students that its roots grew from frost and ash. Sometimes I still wake to the sound of engines in the dark. Sometimes I smell smoke. But then I remember the faces that refused to turn away, even when mercy was forbidden. War teaches you how fragile kindness is, and how strong it can be when it refuses to die.